Welcome to Missing the Mark, where we look for meaning in strange places. I'm Christopher. I recently got a chance to speak with Dr. Steve Turley, whose his subject of research is about the global resurgence of religion. It's a very, very interesting topic. We had a very good conversation. So let me give you a brief bio of Dr. Turley, and then the conversation we had. So here's a brief bio of him. Steve Turley, PhD from Durham University, is an internationally recognized scholar, speaker, and classical guitarist. He is the author of Awakening Wonder, A Classical Guide to Truth, Goodness, and Beauty, and The Ritualized Revelation of the Messianic Age, Washings and Meals in Galatians and 1 Corinthians. Steve blogs on the church, society and culture, education, and the arts at turleytalks.com. Link in the description. He is a faculty member at Tall Oaks Classical School in Bear, Delaware, where he teaches theology, Greek, and rhetoric, and professor of fine arts at Eastern University. Steve lectures at universities, conferences, and churches throughout the U.S. and abroad. His research and writings have appeared in such journals as Christianity and Literature, Calvin Theological Journal, First Things, Touchstone, and the Chesterton Review. He and his wife, Akiko, have 4 children and live in Newark, Delaware, where they together enjoy fishing, gardening, and watching Duck Dynasty marathons. So Dr. Turley was very interesting to talk to. It was a very interesting subject that he studies and has a lot of information about things sort of as they are on the ground in a lot of different cultures. It was very interesting to talk about and to try trends on. So I hope you enjoy this conversation as much as I did. So, Dr. Turley, thank you very much for joining me. Your area of research that I recently saw you talking with Max Kolbe about is very interesting. And could you give me just a little bit, how did you get into studying the phenomenon of religion across the world, and how do you go about studying it?
It's great to be with you too, Christopher. I came into Christianity, interestingly enough, through politics. So my Christianity has always been very socially informed. So I became a Christian, or in many ways returned to the church in 1994, and largely through the work of the Christian Coalition. And so I found myself understanding Christianity in very socio-cultural-like terms. But that didn't become any kind of formal study really until the mid-2000s when I started doing my doctorate work. And when I started doing my doctorate work, I was introduced to a field of study known as, well, they would call it social anthropology. We'd call it cultural anthropology. And what that's basically doing is, well, my wife likes to say when she explains what I do, she says, well, I'm basically a cultural anthropologist where I analyze cultures and so forth. And when she explains it, she goes, well, he's kind of like those guys who go and live with the pygmies, or, you know, those Aboriginal tribes in New Guinea and so forth, but without actually leaving, because I like Christian societies more, so I don't have to do that, which is nice. I prefer that. So what I'm basically was introduced to it at Durham University. One of my supervisors was a cultural anthropologist who actually did live with a Tibetan tribe for a number of months. She just opened up my eyes to a whole new way of seeing the world in terms of critical study. How does a society function? What is it sacred? How does it view ecology in the world? How does it order its society? What's its views of gender? What's its views of race? Why does it eat the way it does? How does it keep time? And what's its ethics? How are people supposed to behave in various contexts and the like? That became a grid by which I began to look at not just the field of study that I was doing, which was early Christianity, but indeed the whole of life and society. And so that's how I started getting into sort of a deep read of culture and society as a whole.
Interesting. So how then, at what point did you start looking at the more modern? Because one of the trends that you discussed with Max is that we're seeing a strong resurgence in religious observation. Would you say religious living? Um, I know that actually a really interesting thing. If you wouldn't mind recapping quickly, you had in that previous interview you had mentioned where the word religious even came from,
Oh
which
yeah.
is an interesting context. If you wouldn't mind recapping that.
Yeah, I guess, it's interesting you just said that, because I think that was the tipping point for me in many respects. That's how I ended up getting involved in more modern understandings and sort of resurgent Christian cultures today. Um, the term religion, historically speaking, is it really has nothing to do with how we use the term often today. Today we tend to use the term, post enlightenment as your personal persuasions, your personal sentiments towards supernatural beings. But back in the day, religion, or the Latin religio, meant social obligations. And Bill Cavanaugh is the one who did some wonderful work on this, etymological work on this, and develops it into the modern era. And I think he really held my hand and drew me into this period of time we're living in. Religion, or religario, or religare, is the etymological root of religio. It's two words, re, so as to repeat, and ligare, which means to tie or to bind. There's nothing inherently, divine about the term. It is simply fulfilling one's oughts, one's social obligations. Now, back in the day, that involved the gods. They didn't have this split that we have between public and private, or between, religion or science or anything like that.
Or
So
church and
my
state.
social obligations to my parents, my guild, my kin, what have you, my city, also translate into social obligations to my gods in whatever context. And then that was developed through the centuries among Christians, particularly Augustine, in terms of true religio and false religio. So true religio are true obligations, obligations that are harmonious with God's economy of goods. False religio are obligations that how do you want to,
Serve the wrong master.
deform. Yeah, they deform God's economy of goods. I like to, when I explain it to my students, I like to say, look, it's good to love a baby and it's good to love a ham sandwich, but if they're both falling and I rush to save the ham sandwich, that's a bad. Now, I do have to explain that for a while with my male students. They want to, ask what kind of ham it is. They want to know if the baby was annoying, all that stuff. But eventually they get it. And that's what Augustine was basically saying, is that Christianity gave us a full vision, a restored vision of God's economy of goods in its most beautiful and right form. And these other religions could be right in some ways, but at some point they're going to mar and deform that economy of goods. And then you get into the modern period, and religion takes on a completely different meaning because of the Enlightenment's commitment to scientific rationalism. It basically limited knowledge to that which could be verified through the scientific method, and anything that couldn't be, like social obligations or like divine things and so forth, that was pushed out of the realm of knowledge. So now religion is something you believe but you don't know. So it has a very interesting history, and of course now it seems to be, I make the argument, it's resurging back to its original term. People recognizing, look, you're gonna have a religion, you're gonna have a basis for social order that's rooted in faith, one way or the other. Some people will say, I believe in Christ. Others will say, I believe in the separation between church and state. Well, you're both confessing creeds, and it's simply arbitrary to consign one to religion and the other one to reason.
By the way, a quick historical question about the time period of that switchover, if you have a sense of it.
Yeah.
Because there's something very interesting. Pride and Prejudice happens to be one of my favorite novel, really. There's something very interesting when, at one point, Elizabeth mentions that it was published in 1807.
Okay, so yeah.
And there's one part where the character Elizabeth mentions she's thinking about something that she'd never heard about any gross immorality from this other character, no irreligious habits. And
Right.
would that be a time period where the concept of irreligious habits had not fully transitioned over to our more modern understanding and would have been a more socially encompassing, do you think? Do you have a
I
sense of the
think
history of that?
I think so. The way I'm understanding, the way I'm reading it, 19th century is still quite religious in, sort of the classic sense of the term as we would use it. And it's really so 1870. It's interesting because that's, I think that's right around the time Dostoevsky is making the observation that I'm seeing it. I'm seeing this notion of life apart from God emerging. And so it was there. It was certainly there among the intellectuals, Voltaire going back to the 18th century. But whether it actually makes its way down, to the shoe shop salesman or something like that, and through the aristocracy and the like, yeah, it's.
It's
I think you have to
possible,
wait.
though.
Yeah, yeah, but certainly when you get into full-blown globalization, this really technologically based society, that's when religion becomes almost fully privatized in that sense.
So now, fast forwarding, historical curiosity aside, fast
Yeah,
forwarding to now in 2017, what's the most compelling reasons you see for um, the thesis of this resurgence in religion globally?
a book just came out that really states it beautifully. I got to say, I just read it a couple of weeks back. I'm sure you're probably familiar with Rodney Stark and his work.
Actually, I'm
Um,
not.
Okay, Rodney Stark is a very interesting scholar. I believe he's an agnostic, believe it or not, which he says he's a bit embarrassed by. And he just wrote a book called The Triumph of Faith. And its whole thesis is that the world is going through a religious awakening now. There are more religious people, intentionally religious people, than at any other time in history, in human history. And he basically he throws out, I mean, he summarizes what I've seen as more or less scattered information beautifully. It's called The Triumph of Faith. And he notes, for example, that in Latin America, Pentecostalism is on fire. And this is going on while more Catholics than ever are attending Mass. There are more Christians in sub-Saharan Africa than there are anywhere else on the earth. We have the resurgence of Russian Orthodoxy in Russia as a major cultural, political, and social force. You have imperial Shintoism playing a larger role in Japan than it has since World War II. You have Confucian philosophy making a comeback in China, the Politburo, and you have an Islamic Republic replacing a secular republic in Erdogan's Turkey. And as this is going on, we're seeing, as Stark points out, Christianity outpace all religions by far, including Islam. Islam doesn't even come near Christianity right now in terms of growth. Christianity is right now 33% of the world's population. Islam is 22% of the world's population. All the forecasts were that Islam is growing, not because of conversion. Islam doesn't tend to grow through conversion. It grows through endogamy. It grows through procreation rates. And the procreation rates that were attributed to Islam back in the 80s and 90s have found to be grossly exaggerated. As a matter of fact, Islam is going through a very bizarre demographic recession.
Oh,
They're not having children. Even European Muslims are not having children. The irony is that conservative Christians are. Conservative Christians are having children more than, I believe, any other conservative religious group. So we're winning not just converts like in Africa and in South America, but we're also outgrowing and in terms of our families. Any other faith, most especially secularism. Secularists aren't having kids.
mm-hmm.
And so you're seeing
Yeah.
studies by Eric Kaufman that are arguing that by 2050, you're going to notice a dramatic demographic shift. Conservative Christians will be the majority and secularists will be the minority. They already are in terms of a world population, only about 20%, not even, of the world population. They'll fall down to about 12%. And Hinduism, the Hindu nationalism, the Christianity revival that's going on in China, which is utterly stunning. I teach Chinese students, and they all witness to it, all from mainland China. And they said, yeah, the church is on fire out there. It's amazing. So they're coming over here to get educated, to bring it back over there, you know, to continue just this beautiful networking with Western Christianity. You have the revitalization of the faith in Central Europe, particularly what's known as the Visegrad Four. So that's Poland and Hungary, Slovakia, not so much Czech Republic yet. It's getting there, though. You have church attendance rates in Poland of over 50%. You have church attendance rates in sub-Saharan Africa hitting 80%. We've never seen that before. Remember, medieval piety was primarily domestic piety. Medieval piety in Europe, the churches were in the cities. The vast 90% of the population was in the villages. They didn't get to go to church often. And so the whole notion of weekly attendance, that actually tends to be more of a Protestant Reformation thing in order to really push the teaching of Scripture. And of course, the Puritans mandated it to a certain extent here in the colonies. So we had never really seen anything like weekly worship at 80% levels. We're seeing that now. So we're seeing a mass resurgence of religion going on all over the world, and in many respects, we ain't seen nothing yet.
Interesting. So no, this brings up the obvious question. Oh, hold on, getting echo. Okay, this brings up the obvious question that, given all this, a lot of people, especially here in America, will take have a much more pessimistic feeling, and so
right.
So let me see how to put this. Why would you say it is that for so many people it seems like the world is sliding into atheistic materialist hedonism?
That's a great atheist materialistic hedonism. I love it. Yeah,
I should throw in materialism in the philosophical sense, philosophical
yes.
materialism, not buying lots of things.
Yeah. And I would see a connection between that and the consumer-based sort of narcissism and the like. No, absolutely. Well, and the short answer is that it is becoming more secular. It is becoming more materialistic, hedonistic, narcissistic. And here's the important caveat: at one level. So my problem with a lot that passes as cultural and social analysis is they focus only on that level. There's plenty to focus on. There's a lot of creepy stuff going on right now. I mean, we literally have arrived to the point where our intelligentsia don't know the difference between a man and a woman. We've actually come to that point. And no matter, homosexuality was flourishing in the Greco-Roman world, but they still knew what a man and a woman was. They still knew what marriage was. We've come to that point. There's plenty wrong out there. The problem is that that's, as I just rattled off for you, that's not the only thing that's going on. Society is counterpuntal. Culture is counterpuntal. So you're going to have soprano lines that might be really, really screechy and horrible, and they'll be right in front of you, and they'll be divas, and that's all you see on television. It's all you see on the radio or hear on the radio. All that you see in magazines, all that's reported on the globalist news, the secular news. But there are bass lines. There are tenor lines. I'm not trying to be sexist here, but that are very different. and are singing a different tune. And the question is, if you could sort of try to gauge the trajectories, where are we going? What's the future? What's it going to be 20, 30, 40 years out? And why would we think that? And what we're going to see is, I think, globalistic secularism becoming increasingly perverted, increasingly morally contracted, but then increasingly begin to die off. It's not reproducing itself. It's not making a lot of converts. We're finding Christian conservatives, our children stay in the faith. All those figures that came out that said like 75% of, evangelical kids or conservative Catholic kids leave the faith, bunk. They're nonsense. Again, these are just quick little Pew research things or Gallup research things. The real hardcore study finds kids who grow up in conservative homes, guess what? They become conservative. Just in the same way they learn the language from their parents, they learn their religion from their parents. And that's been going on for thousands of years. And we're finding that whether it's the Amish or whether it's conservative Catholic Poles, we're able to transmit our cultures pretty well through domestic piety. So I think what you're seeing here is that secular world is doing the same. It's propagating its faith to its kids, but unfortunately it's not having a lot of them. It's aborting the ones that it does have. It's gay marriaging a lot out of existence. And the result is that Christianity is growing, traditionalist society is growing, secular society is shrinking. But while it shrinks, it sure stinks.
Now, I'm curious, actually, because, of course, you mentioned the two components. One is reproducing and passing on domestically. The other is making converts. Like for example, the, what was their names? The Shakers, were people who they're the ones, for those who don't know, that they're a Christian community where the males and females were strictly segregated. Nobody had any children. They only persisted through converts. And for a while that worked, and then it stopped working. They stopped making converts. And then, of course, since they had no children, they just all died out. But so, I mean, secularism, did experience a flourishing, certainly not demographically, but by converts. So I'm curious what you'd say as reasons why the globalist secularist sort of idea is having trouble making converts now. Because I mean, obviously, for a while it was going gangbusters on making converts.
It certainly was. Yeah, because it took over the institutions, the major elite institutions. And I think, by the way, that's key to why it's falling apart. So that's a great question. I think it's actually, I could let you in on a little bit of just some of these controversies are going on in post-secular scholarship and the like. So more and more scholars are recognizing that the world is becoming more and more religious, that we really are experiencing a religious awakening here. But they don't necessarily answer the question as to why. Why are we experiencing this religious awakening and its counter secular recession? Why? Why is that going on? And everybody has sort of their different take on it. And so where I come down on, this is where my political analysis sort of comes in. Where I come in on it is the notion that's been batted around of late in studying the far-right movements, the so-called far-right movements in Europe, a notion known as post-security polities, or post-security politics. I think I'd prefer that term. Post-security politics is a sensibility towards life that recognizes that the security that the nation state used to give to us, namely border security, economic security, and existential or identity or cultural security, those are all falling apart. Our border security is falling apart, obviously, because of immigration, mass immigration, and terrorism. Our economic insecurity, particularly in the West, is coming through what's known as a globalistic division of labor, where all of our industry and manufacturing are just going to the global South, and all the capital is getting repositioned around our urban centers. So, LA and Manhattan are doing great, but Pennsatucky is really suffering, kind of thing. And then thirdly, the existential insecurity is coming largely from the de-traditionalizing forces of globalization. That's really the primary carrier of secularism, I would argue, at least, that globalistic societies tend to be very consumer-based, and consumer-based societies hate traditions. They want to get rid of traditions. It's always about the new, the cutting edge. It's about the standardized. It's about the transnational. It's about the narcissist.
What they already have.
Yeah, right, exactly. Great point. Whereas religious sensibilities are much more aesthetic. They're much more. They love leisure in the classical sense of things like worship and reading and time with the family and things like that. They're not obsessed with going to the mall. So what secularized globalistic societies have done is, however inadvertently, is they provoke these three insecurities: border insecurity, economic insecurity, and existential insecurity. And so the answer to all this, then, the insecurities, becomes this re-traditionalization. We're reasserting the sovereignty of our borders. We're reasserting localism and manufacturing and industry and America first and buy American and the like. And you're seeing the same thing in Poland and Russia and Hungary. And when Trump was over there, there was a hashtag. When Trump gave his speech in Poland, there was a hashtag Poland first and make Poland great again kind of stuff. My argument is that Trump is an indicator of much larger forces, much bigger than Trump himself. So I'm actually rather neutral on Trump the man. I'm much more interested in him as he actually evidences this sort of nationalism, populism, and this re-traditionalization that's answering the impoverishments and the insecurities that secularized globalization, however inadvertently, has brought to us.
There's something very Chestertonian about the thing you mentioned about the hashtag Poland first and make Poland great again, because Chesterton was a great English patriot, and one of the points he mentioned over and over is, as an English patriot, he's very happy that French are French patriots. He doesn't want a Frenchman to be an English patriot. That would make no sense. It makes perfect sense for a Frenchman to love France in the same way that he loves England, which was a little bit of a counterpoint to certain rhetoric of his day, I think. But,
okay, can I tap in on that, Christopher? Because that's a fantastic point, I think, at least, on the difference between the kind of nationalism, and in Europe, you're quite right. In Europe, they prefer the term patriotism, because nationalism smacks of fascism. So they prefer patriotism. I use them interchangeably, so I have to apologize for that for all of our European viewers here, for if there's misunderstanding there. But you're absolutely right. One of the fundamental differences between, say, the new nationalism / patriotism and the fascism of old, as it were, is precisely secular modernity. Secular modernity, in effect, said that there was a one-size-fits-all for the world. Anything prior to secular modernity was ignorance. I've actually heard people say savage man existed up to about 200 years ago, till we started discovering the laws of nature and the scientific laws and the like. And so it became increasingly popular in the late 19th and early 20th century to say that, yes, there is one political system for all people. There is one economic system and there is one cultural meaning system for all people. The West said the one political system was liberal democracy. The Soviet East said the one economic system was communism. And Italy and Germany were saying that the one cultural meaning system was fascism. They were all expansionist. They were all one-size-fits-all standardized modernism, just from different vantage points. That's dead. Modernity is that you ask anyone on the streets today, is there a one-size-fits-all political, economic, and cultural meaning system for everybody? What are they going to say? You crazy? You know, I mean, try it on the college campus sometime. You'll probably get kicked out. You'll need therapy or some kind of counseling if you were to say something like that. That's the real postmodernism, in my opinion, that's currently underway right now. Now, modernity's fruit is still being exported in the form of globalism, but the roots, the modernist roots, have died. That's Stepan Mistrovich of Texas A&E's thesis, Texas A&M's thesis, that A&E's nice channel if you want to watch it. His thesis is that the roots of globalism have died, in that we're now postmodernists, we're not modernists anymore. But the fruit of globalism continues to be exported by our elites because, well, Steve Bannon would say it's their business model. That's how they make their money. And I think he's really right on it, maybe overly cynical, but I think he's correct. And so with all of that, the real postmodernism that's going on now is a return back to nation, culture, tradition, land, localism, ethnicity, and the like. And that is precisely what you're seeing. You're seeing nationalists all cheering each other on. Marine Le Pen is cheering on Geert Wilders. Geert Wilders is cheering on Andrzej Duda. Andrzej Duda is cheering on Viktor Orban. They're all cheering on Trump. They cheer on Vladimir Putin. They all respect each other's borders because they just want to recover their nation, their cultures, and their traditions again. They don't want some kind of mass one-size-fits-all as liberal democracy, communism, and fascism represented.
Interesting. Now, something that seems a little bit of a counterpoint to consider, not to the observations, but sort of that forces on the trends. Is that because something that I've seen, although this is not how, in general, atheistic materialists would put it, but I mean, roughly, okay, the very Christian way of putting it is essentially that it's difficult for a rich man to enter the kingdom of heaven, and technology is making everybody rich, and therefore everyone's, that's a major force against being religious. The perhaps more generally accessible way of putting it, roughly speaking, is that one of the major cultural effects of religion is putting restraints on people's natural impulses in order to, channel them in more positive, generally viable directions and away from highly destructive ones. Like, for example, putting restraints on fornication so that people don't just have children everywhere and then fail to take care of them. But that technology in its march is one by one getting rid of all these negative externalities, that it can divorce children from fornication, for example, and that through the use of recreational drugs that you can you can have a good time without having to actually invest in any in learning things or developing skills or making friends. You can just instead get the benefits of that without the work and so on. So all of the religious structures that were suited to an earlier age where we had these constraints of nature are becoming outmoded because through things like contraceptives and drugs and so on, you can have all the benefits without needing all of the restraint. So I'm curious how you would answer that sort of
it's a great question. I mean, I couldn't help but think. So, we used to be concerned of being able to buy our way into heaven, and now with materialism and technology, we're buying our way out of heaven. we don't need heaven anymore, right? So yeah, you got it. And I think it was Anthony Giddens, the British sociologist, who made the argument that technological societies, by definition, are post-moral societies. How's that for a term? And it's very much for the reasons that you give. I remember coming across a prayer by a patristic, his name is escaping me, so I'm not going to take up time thinking about it, but it's a beautiful prayer of the lighting of the candles in the church for a Vespers. And in the book I was reading, it's a page-long prayer, and it was just lovely. And this is what he would recite when he's lighting the candles. And it was just this idea, oh God, you who create the stars, you bring these stars down to us through this fire and flame, and now may the Holy Spirit come down from heaven and draw both us and the flame up into you. It's just gorgeous and beautiful and lovely. And can you imagine somebody saying the same kind of prayer when they turn on the lights? They flip a light switch, you know? Of course not. Technology does remove, however inadvertently, a real deep dimension of our lives. And that's also largely because it tends to operate through the mechanisms of science, and science is supposedly value neutral. And so the more scientific and technological society we are, then generally speaking, the more amoral we are, at least amoral sensibilities have plausibility to them. So yes, I think there is something to that, no question. The question is whether it's sustainable, and I don't know if I don't know if I like my answer on this one, but I'm just inclined to go with the notion that human beings are by nature transcendent. You and I share the Christian tradition together. We would say human beings are created in the imago Dei, the image of God, and we inevitably image forth that God of which we are a reflection. So as human beings, it is our nature to create literature, art, music, poetry, drama. It is our nature to see meaning and purpose beyond the mere superficial. And atheism is the king of the superficial. So I just think it's an intuitive sense of the world that it is inherently meaningful. And the meaning does come to us through our cultural practices, but our cultural practices aren't creating the meaning. They're simply channels, or we would say sacramentals, for the conveying of that meaning. So one of the things I think is so fascinating with something like the world of Star Wars is, of course, it's a very technologically savvy world, and yet also a very spiritual one. So I don't see them as mutually exclusive, but they can be if cultural and social forces are pushing them in that opposite direction. But I think eventually they have to come back. There's no way around it.
Now, do you see, because one movement, for example, that I notice, well, it's a large collection of movements, I should say, and small ones, but you can mostly call it like a return to traditional technologies, not in total, not like going off and living in the woods wearing nothing but the uncured loincloth that from an animal you killed, but you see this sort of thing a lot, like buying handmade goods.
Mm-hmm.
For example, like where you can afford it, something like buying a handmade knife or buying a handmade article of clothing that so that being one thing, the organic movement in food,
Mm-hmm.
which
Mm-hmm.
in theory has something to do with with health and stuff, but is largely, if you, at least all the people I've talked to, just personally, not in a research sense, it has a lot more to do with the idea of a more traditional style of farming and getting away from industrial, making it somewhat ironic that there are completely industrial methods of organic farming. But that being sort of a secret.
Always going to come in and steal it, you know that.
Oh, yeah,
And they're going to.
But that's largely, a secret hidden behind the curtain, as much as the organic industry can do it.
Right.
The Wonder Bread is proud of its giant factories and its huge Wonder Bread making machines and its technological stuff, whereas as the organic equivalent thereof tries to pretend those things don't exist.
Yeah.
It's a very loud bird making that giant mechanical whirring sound. Anyway, so you see those sorts of movements. Things like people still go out for hikes. We've got cars and bicycles and so on, but people like to get out and take walks, and increasingly there's been a return to exercise.
Yeah.
It's funny, my grandparents' generation, born in the 20s and 30s, viewed exercise as something horrific, something to avoid at all costs, and even talked about the medical professionals wanting everyone to lay down as much as possible so as not to wear out their bodies.
Right.
And in the modern era, in contemporary, last few decades, there's been much more of an idea that laying down is a terrible idea, and getting up and working, even if you're not a a peasant out in the fields, well, there's the peasant out in the fields machine at your local gym. I'm sure there's somebody somewhere has come up with some sort of resistant band hoeing technique, and partially for comedic effect, but exercise. So, do you see all of these things as being connected, or do you think those are separate threads?
No, I do. I do. I see it as part of what we would call re-traditionalization. For example, I don't think it is coincidental that when Pope Benedict brought back the Latin Mass, they were expecting 60 and 70-year-olds to show up, like my mother-in-law, and say, "Oh, I remember when we recited in the Latin. Oh, isn't this great?" And to everyone's shock, who was showing up at the 16 to 26-year-olds, and they did a wonderful spread on a South Carolina priest who had learned the Latin Mass and started practicing it regularly, and his church exploded, I think, 3 or 4 times. It was about 100 people, and his parish is now about 400 people, and most of them are young people in their early 20s. He confirms it. They hunger, they crave for something deep and authentic, something that defines them. They don't define it. The consumerist world, by definition, is a world that has no value apart from that which I tend to give to it. Something is only worth something if it's worth, quote, my time. And people are just so hungry to encounter something that's not worth their time, but rather something of which they're not worthy. And that's where I think we go back to our traditional practices. And our traditional practices are sacramentals for meaning and purpose and the sacred that satisfies this existential insecurity that the modern world is making us face. When you get to choose your own gender, you have to first recognize that you're genderless, and that's scary. That's weird. There's something beautiful about my gender being fearfully and wonderfully made, and being larger than myself. You and I, when we were chatting earlier, you said when you got married, the priest inadvertently said, "I now present you to the attendees. I now present you, instead of the bride of Chris, he said the bride of Christ," right? Which was, it was so sweet and so wonderfully true. That's the beautiful thing, is your genders are pictures of the kingdom of God, of Christ the bridegroom coming to marry the church, his bride, which is itself reflective of heaven coming down to earth. And heaven and earth are hetero, they are not homo. Our gender is part of a larger cosmic reality and cosmic narrative. Boy, when you discover that, existential insecurities tend to dissipate, and you've come home. So I think there's something really there that you were talking about that's very much linked to the larger picture here.
It really reminds me of something Chesterton mentioned in his book Orthodoxy, where he's talking about madmen. And there was one in particular, he used several, the person who thinks he's the king of France, and person, I think it's like the person who thinks there's a conspiracy of all men against him, and the person who thinks that he's Jesus Christ. And he said, the thing is, you don't want to argue with these people. In fact, if you try to argue with them, you almost certainly lose.
Yes.
Because they're
only logical, right? That's
right, exactly. Yeah. They're only logical. And I had the great line that a small circle is just as complete as a larger circle, but it's not as big. Right. And the problem is that they're on this track of the circle. It's a perfect circle. It always loops back. You can never get off of it, but it's a very small circle. And to the madman, what you really want to say to him is, okay, suppose, how much bigger the world would be if you could just realize that you didn't actually matter very much in it, that how much happier you'd be if you realized that as you walked through the street, no one cared. And rather than is every man really concerned with your business? Has no man any business of his own but yours? How much happier it'd be if you could break out of that into the sunny world where no one cares. And but then the one about Jesus Christ, that one, are you really a God? What a small and pitiful cosmos.
Right. I remember that. Yep. I
And
think it's chapter 1, if I recall, isn't it? He does. I think this is his opening salvo, or
it is.
yeah.
It is. It's
What a
right there
tiny.
in
So if you are Jesus Christ, what a tiny and pathetic cosmos you oversee. Right.
yeah. What is it? Small. Must all men hope in your mercy. Um, and it was, and it's something very interesting. The thing that you said about how people long for something that they didn't make, because also that part about that in the consumer society, by definition, things are worth what they are to you, and there's that law of economics that a thing is worth what people are willing to pay for it in an economic rather than moral sense.
Sure, of course, yeah.
And it's very interesting because in a practical sense, it's entirely true. You could have something of tremendous moral value, but if a person is only willing to pay you 10 cents for it, you can't get more than 10 cents for it.
Right.
And so, but in a consumer society with so much available, it's interesting that does sort of bleed over. That what is a thing worth morally? If no one ever asks that question, if they only ever ask the question of what's it worth economically, that's the only question and then it is you put value into things by being willing to pay for them.
Right.
And I think that's such a great image of how we long for something that we long for something that can give worth to us, not something that needs us to give it worth.
You got it.
That we're not God. We can't sustain the world. We need a God to sustain us.
Exactly.
And so I really like that.
Yeah, I've heard it, but I think it was now someone who wrote "Beauty Will Save the World." Wolfe, WOFE. Forgetting his first name, but he, said it best that something happened to the great artwork. Something happened to creation when we turned it into mere nature, or artwork when we turn it into just mere culture, as if it's just our attempt to impose and project meaning on otherwise meaningless processes. They could no longer sustain their beauty. They're too small to collapse the beauty that they're conveying solely into themselves. They have to be receptacles. They have to be conduits. They have to be instrumental or sacramental of something much, much larger than themselves. And of course, in the Christian tradition, all who've been baptized in Christ have been clothed with Christ. We are therefore all one in Christ, in Christ, in Christ. We are more than we could ever be in and of ourselves.
Yeah, not to go on quoting Chesterton forever, but there's actually a fascinating essay, I can't remember where he was talking about art for art's sake. How this was the big cry that the artist needed to smash all restraints in order to truly embrace art for its sake. And he said, well, you can debate the morality of the thing, but since it's already happened, we can look at the results. Mm-hmm. And have these people actually produced any great art? Has anyone in search of art for art's sake actually made anything that anyone wants to look at? What's the result of art for art's sake that we have a mediocrity for the poet laureate?
Right.
I wish I could remember which essay.
Or to listen to that, John Cage's 4 minutes and 33 seconds. Right? Music has been reduced to silence. It's crazy.
There's something. It seems to me related there that in that cry of art for art's sake that we had heard, that it smashed all boundaries, and then it had no shape. It had, if you have nothing but art, you have nothing, because art has to be a vessel for something else, as you were saying.
Right. Exactly.
So that's, because it's certainly, it's the, by and large, all the best art is religious art, because it's actually, it's there for some higher purpose beyond itself, and therefore serves it. It's funny too, on the subject of weddings, and a very closely related thing, because I've been to some weddings where people said the traditional vows that everybody says, and I've been to a few weddings where people say vows that they themselves wrote, and I love my friends dearly who wrote their own vows, but it did not have anything near the same effect. That when two people subsume themselves into the mass of humanity by doing the same thing that everybody else did, it is immeasurably more meaningful than when they're just doing their own thing.
So it defines that, they don't define it. Yeah,
and so in that moment, because a marriage, at least within the Christian conception of marriage, where it is binding on people, where you're making vows that are actual vows, not vows that are sort of have an asterisk on them. And the asterisk says, well, if I want
as
to.
as long as I identify as a man, I will be your husband. Yeah.
Yeah, well, and as long as we get along, and
Right, right.
there's another great one. This one I was in the Chesterton magazine because it's from some column, but we're saying if you were to actually say what people mean, he was talking, I think, about the liberalization of divorce, which is a discussion in his day. If you were to say what people actually mean, um, it was you'd summon all your friends together and to say, I witness here before this congregation and before God and His angels that Sarah and I shall enjoy or shall stay together as long as we enjoy each other's company, or shall remain friends until we quarrel. That's what it was, I think. But no one would.
So good.
No one would ever, walk a mile to say such a thing, let alone gather all his friends. And anyway, so that's the thing, that in those grand moments of your life, to subsume yourself to do the same thing everyone else is doing is a form of humility. It's bending, it's bending down to join yourself to the same yoke that many others have taken. For those who don't know, yoke being the thing that you put on an ox so that it can, or a horse so it can pull a plow. It's stooping your neck to do the same thing many others have done in the way those others have done it, and as such, you become part of something much bigger and greater and grander than yourself. And in doing so, you become yourself greater and grander.
Absolutely. You
By becoming
become
a part of it.
always called to be. Yep. The Father is not Father without the Son. The Son is not the Son without the Father, and the Son are not the Son, Father and the Son without the Holy Spirit. We are not Christians without the church. I mean, it's just, you could keep going. We are relational beings, and it is inevitable, in my opinion, that the lack of this in this sort of secular consumerist globalist world, that's its death knell. People are not going to die for this, as Chesterton pointed out. People are not going to give their lives for this stuff, but they will die for religion, land, custom, tradition, honor, chivalry, and the like. That it strikes at the very heart of what it means to be human.
Well, there's another interesting way of giving your life, which is because there's giving your life in the sense of being willing to die, but there's also giving your life in the sense of being willing to give to another enormous amounts of your time, which brings us back to something you had mentioned about parenthood. Because I mean, you can find amongst secular people anti-natalist movements, but you can also find, where they hold it's immoral to have children. But you can also find just a lot of people who look at it and make the very simple calculation. Well, it's not really a good deal to be a parent. I mean, surveys show all over the place parents are less happy, and in the sense of the sort of enjoyment you would get from roller skating or flying a kite or skiing or so on, I have no doubt whatsoever, as a parent of 3 small children, that parents are less happy, because what you're actually doing is it's a great imago Dei. You made people in order to give to them more, but now you're giving to them more for quite a number of years, and you're giving to a lot of them, and unlike God, we're not infinite. So there is a sense in which it does diminish a part of you to have children, because you have to give it to them. You have to, in that sense, be willing for a portion of your life to die that they might live.
Mm-hmm.
And that in itself, too, it doesn't make any sense from a maximizing your happiness sort of sense. Because it is, as far as I can tell, looking back at my own parents and what they suffered for my sake, dealing with me when I was a kid, it is very much a gift. It's not something you really repay.
Right.
It's just generosity from one generation to the next.
Yeah, no, it's a great point. Again, unless you have that sense of piety, unless you have that sense of obligation, unless, dare I say it, you have that religion, you're not going to engage in it, and you're going to suffer the consequences long term. The society that you are perpetuating will eventually begin to recede, just quite naturally.
Yeah, well, there's also an element of faith in it as well. It's funny, I just had this conversation with various people over the years about like, well, with all that's wrong in the world, does it really make sense to bring people into it? You saw that, I think, in spades, during the Cold War in America, with there's a good chance they won't even live to be 20. Does it make
Right.
sense to have children? But I mean, that's universal. I mean, there are always diseases and disasters, and terrorism, car accidents, whatever. Life is dangerous. It's got 100% fatality rate, for the most part. And the so there's that faith that, well, I can't rationally figure out why this is a good idea to have children. And, I can't guarantee that they're going to have a good life. And you just need a leap of faith that it's worth it for their sake to give them existence.
Yeah, yeah. I think a lot of people don't know that the word school that we use comes from a Latin and Greek word, very similar word. The Latin would be scola, and the Greek would be scoli, or scole, as some people say, and the way they pronounce the Greek. And it meant leisure. And leisure was not sitting on a hammock, sipping lemonade. Leisure was doing things that are good for their own sake. So labor back in the days, you had to do something in order to get something else out of it. So I like to ask my teenage students, do you work full-time at Chick-fil-A or part-time at Chick-fil-A because you like chicken so much? Is that why you do it?
And for the glory of the chicken sandwich.
They all chuckle on that one. I tell you, I like chicken the first day, and that was it. They do it for something else. They're doing something for money and paycheck and the like. And but
hence
why
the
do we?
Servile arts.
Yeah, exactly. Servile arts. But why do we read great literature? Why do we recite poetry? Why do we listen to beautiful music? Why do we encounter divine liturgies? Why do we do these things? I push on my students. Why do you watch these movies? Why do you go to a movie? Why do you listen to this music? In the end, they'll say things like, well, because it's cool or because it's fun. But in the end, I'll push them and say, because it's its own reward. That's why you do it. And those are the things you love to do. So life is its own reward. Life is good in and of itself. I love it with the Genesis account of creation, where God says, and it's good, and it's good, and it's good. And then he creates humanity. He says, and it's very good. There's something beautiful about life. And we're seeing that. We're seeing a resurgence of this pronatalism going on. We're seeing a resurgence of pro-life sentiments going on. It's really quite a beautiful time right now.
It's interesting, and I think possibly a good note to end on. It's something I had heard that I haven't confirmed with any Jewish scholars, but that on the seventh day God rested, within the Genesis account, and that the Jewish understanding of rest, from which also the Sabbath, the Shabbos, derives, is not rest in the sense of inactivity, but rest in the sense of contemplation.
Yeah.
That you can't contemplate and be actively doing something, because your attention is focused when you're actively doing something, and that so you need to sit back and contemplate, to take in all things at once, as opposed to focusing on one thing. And hence the division where for 6 days one works, and for one day one when one works in this, one focuses, and for one day one contemplates, one takes in everything. And so an interesting thing there about leisure, about the that it is right for man to work, and it's good for man to work. It's been working is one of the things that has been given to us, but at the same time too, so has leisure, and hence that idea of working for leisure, and hence the need to be able to sit back and take it in and see that it's good. So it's a really interesting. I like that note that you.
Oh, absolutely. And you can go even, wonderful thoughts there. You can go even another step, where Aristotle would talk about contemplation as that act which most separated us from the animals. So, animals work, and animals rest in the sleepy sense, but the one thing they can't do is they can't contemplate. They cannot bring their thoughts up into the realm of eternity like humans can. Hence the term contemplare, to think thoughts according with the temple. contemplare, the sanctified imagination, and hence Aristotle and the Jewish tradition coming together means that we are most human when we're in prayer. That's our ultimate human act.
Wow, that's a great note to end on. So thank you very much, Dr. Turley. It's been a very fascinating conversation.
Thanks, Christopher. You have a wonderful channel. I look forward to watching it many times.
God bless.
God bless you too. Well,
I hope you enjoyed that as much as I did. It was a really interesting subject, I thought. I had a great time in the conversation, and really interesting ideas to talk about. And until next time, may you hit everything you aim at.